Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and today's episode is the first in a new series called Subgenre Spotlight, where in each episode I'll be digging into a different subgenre of film and explaining why I love it. First up is the Brief Encounter movie. Enjoy. Since our very first installment of Subgenre Spotlight falls around Valentine's season, I thought it would be nice to focus on my favorite kind of romantic story. I've never been a huge fan of rom-coms or romantic films in general. I've always thought romance felt at home in broader stories, but a focus entirely on romance seemed to lack any narrative tension. They either end up together or they don't, right? She either chooses to be with the dorky but sweet childhood friend, or that classically handsome guy with a mysterious past and a smoking habit. It felt like a type of fantasy for sure, but not the kind I was interested in growing up. That is to say, romance films rarely had dragons, sword duels, or spaceships, so for the most part, I was out. But around when I was maybe 8 or 9, my mom introduced me to Rob Reiner's The Princess Bride. And much like Fred Savage's sick boy character whose grandfather sat by the bedside to read him a book, I was compelled by the swashbuckling, quirky characters and storming of the castle, but I merely tolerated the romance. To my surprise, though, after a couple rewatches, it wasn't long before I even started liking the romance. In fact, years later, after dozens of viewings, and despite knowing the ending like the back of my hand, I found myself heartbroken when Princess Buttercup and Wesley were separated after surviving the fire swamp, and I was even scared that Buttercup would have to marry that douchebag Prince Humperdinck. Sure, there were other sources of drama and suspense that heightened it for me, but I really did want these characters to end up together. And I learned that the more obstacles placed between them, the more I rooted for them. Since then, I kept waiting for another film to come along and engage me in its romance, but I was starting to feel like that time would never come. Maybe The Princess Bride was just a flash in the pan. During my teenage years, I went back to getting my kicks from sword fights and galaxy-spanning adventures. Until one day, a movie took millennial men, myself included, by storm. And that movie was Mark Webb's 500 Days of Summer. Now, I want to be clear that this film for me at age 19 hit a lot different than it does now at 34. But back then, romance was just confusing to me. I'd had a few false starts at relationships, all of which I assumed fell apart because of me, but I wasn't fully self-aware enough to understand why. I was convinced I was just a romantic who wanted to find his person and give them everything without considering the dozens of human factors that make it far more complicated than that. And that's where 500 Days of Summer comes in. The movie sees everyman Joseph Gordon-Levitt as Tom finding himself enamored with new co-worker Summer, played by my then movie crush Zooey Deschanel, who draws him into her gaze with her funky outfits and cool taste in music. The two begin getting close, though she warns him she's not looking for anything serious, despite montage after montage of them doing things typically associated with romantic relationships. The film depicts it all in a timeline that flies all over the place, from their meeting to a foreshadowed fallout that leaves Tom an emotional wreck. He eventually doubles down on living for himself and finds his own place in the world. The two meet up months later, and Summer, who's now getting married, informs him that there was just something missing between them, and she couldn't place it. Tom begrudgingly accepts this and moves on enlightened, meeting a girl conveniently named Autumn just before the credits roll. Now, this might sound silly, but this movie affected me deeply when I first saw it. I still enjoy the movie to this day, but I view it as more of an artifact of male romanticism. And whether it's self-aware about this or not, it's a pretty thorough examination of a certain toxic nice guy that feels entitled to the heart of any manic pixie dream girl that floats through his life. But at the time, I'd yet to see anything from Woody Allen or Richard Linklater, so a film that not only told the story of romance in an unconventional way, but also had the nerve to not have our leads end up together by the end felt pretty novel. Well, luckily for me, I eventually learned there was an entire subgenre based around this idea that had been around for decades, unofficially called Brief Encounter. Now, you might hear those two words and immediately think aliens, and I promise that episode's coming in the near future. But for now, we're talking specifically about it in the context of relationships, romantic and otherwise, which started with a British film in 1945 called, you guessed it, Brief Encounter. Decades ahead of its time and considered relatively taboo for the era, the film is directed by the legendary David Lean. When he wasn't redefining the cinematic epic with films like Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia, he was subtly upending conventional romance tropes. Brief Encounter follows two strangers, unhappy in their respective marriages, who immediately form a connection at the train station and eventually engage in an emotional affair. The nuance and emotional maturity with which their relationship is depicted is not only ahead of its time for the post-war era, but remained uncommon until decades later. Neither character feels judged for their actions, and their respective spouses aren't written like monsters just to make it easy for us to root for the central affair. It makes perfect sense running parallel to the rise of film noir, with cinema fans across the world growing more compelled by the moral gray areas of storytelling instead of predetermined black and white boundaries. What draws me to this movie and the brief encounter framework in general is that it shows the entire spectrum of love and its fallout, both heightened and expedited by inconveniences that often deflate the idea of fairy tale romance in the real world. It's more relatable and ironically more romantic, even if the characters don't end up together in the end. There would be dabblings in the subgenre over the next few decades, but it never came in the form of a prominent movement until the 90s indie scene opened the floodgates with Richard Linklater's naturalistic masterpiece, Before Sunrise. This movie is in many ways a Trojan horse of a romance movie that feels like something else entirely, and even still it's one of the most romantic films of all time. The film announces its unique perspective immediately as we see an older couple arguing on a train in Austria. Then our leads, American Jesse and the French Celine, played by Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, trade glances and smirks before breaking the ice by speculating what the couple's argument could possibly be about. Their banter turns into flirting, and as Jesse's stop in Vienna approaches, he convinces Celine to join him for the night and catch the next train in the morning. And aside from that, there's no gimmick to manufactured drama. No absurdist comedic touches, just two characters talking, learning about one another and inching closer together as the ticking clock looms in the background. It's a pretty genius construct to inject urgency into an otherwise leisurely plotted film. There's humor here and there, but for the most part, the entertainment value comes in the form of brilliant performances, bringing two well-written characters to life that play off each other naturally. Both characters treat the night like there's nothing to lose, with the assumption that after 12 hours or so, they'll never see each other again. This ironically allows them to have deeper discussions with full transparency, given there's no reason to leave anything unsaid, which also results in a deft avoidance of common romantic tropes and misunderstandings. Throughout the evening, we get little seeds of what would be with these characters if they were to have a lifetime together. How would they spend their time together? What would they talk about? What would potentially cause an argument between them? If you've avoided knowing anything about the movie up until this point, you're probably wondering if they get to see these hypotheticals through. And what I will say is that the ending is hopeful if somewhat ambiguous about their future. And there are two sequels, but they're not quite in the form you'd expect. I think Linklater knew that the film worked so well in isolation as a study of romance at its most fresh and focused, but with an undercurrent of melancholy. So he made the world wait 9 years to see what happened to these characters, and in some ways managed to do it all over again with the added depth of retrospect and regret in 2004's Before Sunset. In between these films, however, the ideas of unfulfilled love and the conflicts of reality and human connection ignited something in filmmakers around the world. Call it the disillusionment of Gen X or simply a natural progression in subverting the idealism of the previous generation, these ideas spoke to people. One of the towering masterpieces of this era came in the form of Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love. It takes place in 1960s Hong Kong and stars two of my favorite actors in Hong Kong cinema, Tony Leung and Maggie Cheung. Returning to the concept of David Lean's brief encounter as two married strangers who form an instant connection. The difference here is that they're neighbors in a congested apartment building, and they grow closer when they begin to suspect that their respective spouses, who are rarely seen in the film, are having an affair. Now, I'll never claim to be an expert on the subject of the British rule over Hong Kong, nor any historical subject for that matter, but the cultural undertones here are clear in that it was a very conservative period for the region. In a Hollywood version of this film, our leads would probably begin a more explicit affair themselves, leave their partners, and begin a life of their own. Here, though, every step towards each other comes with a bit of shame, regardless of their spouse's behavior. So there is subtlety in the way these two dance around, coming up with reasons to spend time with one another. While their spouses are away, for example, they assist each other in role-playing confrontations they fantasize about having with them. There's a very specific intimacy in these characters sharing thoughts and feelings with each other they're afraid to express in any other context. Basically, imagine that one scene in every romance movie where the two leads are staring longingly until you're practically screaming at the screen for them to kiss or express their true feelings. Well, In the Mood for Love is essentially that feeling sustained for 90 minutes straight. In addition to the performances communicating this brilliantly, Wong Kar-wai pulls out all the stops to express this longing through the filmmaking. It's shot with this moody lighting and wide shots that use walls and other obstructions to show the unspoken barrier between the two characters. In the edit, they implement a literal split screen, as well as a bizarre time-lapsing effect on the characters' surroundings as they pass each other on the street. And the cherry on top is Shigeru Umebayashi's melodramatic string-laden score, which cries out loud but the characters are too afraid to say themselves. The finished product is the best-case scenario of what happens when every piece of a film considers the others. In this case, they come together to make a complete masterpiece out of a conceit that ultimately shouldn't work cinematically. There are no confession of love monologues, no running toward each other in the rain. These characters never confront their partners in triumph. Instead, we feel every second of their silent, desperate desire for the courage to do those things. And the painful realism of that is what makes this movie stand out from others, let alone the fact that it manages to be a movie that encourages endless rewatches and discussions for decades after its release. Just a few years later, in 2003, Sofia Coppola took the brief encounter formula to bold new territory in Lost in Translation, which stars Bill Murray as an aging actor promoting whiskey in Japan when his life, and in turn his outlook on it, change when he meets a young and newlywed Yale graduate played by Scarlett Johansson. Although it features a scene where one character chases down the other as well as a climactic kiss, the relationship depicted here is less romantic in nature, though equally impactful on these characters' lives. Despite a wide gap in age and interest, Bob and Charlotte immediately find a shared language and dry wit and an overall jaded view of the world. The peace and slowness they find in each other is contrasted by the sensory overload of the Tokyo setting, showcasing the isolation we can feel even when surrounded by people, and the difference between that and real human connection. In lesser hands, this relationship could feel, to put it bluntly, a little creepy or manipulative on the part of Murray's character. But Coppola does a great job of showing what's under the surface, and what it is about each other that these characters are really connecting to. Bob wants Charlotte to live her life for herself in a way that he himself isn't, and Charlotte wants Bob to realize it's not too late to do the same. This is never really said out loud, but you could easily read it through the lines of brief, calculated dialogue. For instance, one scene sees the two lying in bed staring at the ceiling, the way you would on a therapist's couch. Charlotte then asks Bob if life gets any easier. He fumbles his words, but lands on a definitive yes. Charlotte quickly snaps back with, "Oh yeah? Look at you." These lines might sound like throwaways, and the dialogue that follows contains much more depth and detail, but I like this because it sums up how these characters view each other, and to a degree themselves. Bob is struggling to say life gets any easier because he realizes his cynical disposition doesn't really reflect that. But in the moment, he's also realizing it's true, and admits it's easier than he's letting it be. He's setting aside his self-pity in order to express his empathy and comfort Charlotte. And her, "yeah, look at you," is less of a dismissal of his response and more her calling out Bob for contradicting his own point, possibly suggesting that he's run out of excuses to not be living his life for himself anymore. This movie is packed with little touches like this, and it's a fantastic example of how, while brief encounters are inherently romantic, they sometimes work just as well when the central relationship isn't a strictly romantic one. Within the mood for love, Lost in Translation, and the return of Jesse and Celine in Before Sunset, all within a few years of each other, it guaranteed this formula would be a lasting part of the cinematic landscape. Since then, we've had films every few years expanding upon and redefining what a brief encounter movie is. Some of the best recent examples of transient love on screen have emerged from queer cinema. Renowned modern classics like Call Me By Your Name and Portrait of a Lady on Fire have already proven they're likely to stand the test of time, with the former being about the unique bittersweetness of first love, while the latter explores between the lines of period tropes to find a powerful feminine angle never really seen before on screen, at least not in films taking place in that era. What I've always found special about Call Me By Your Name in particular is that it occupies a unique space in queer romance, and that the fact that Timothée Chalamet's lead Elio is gay is sort of irrelevant to the plot. I'm not sure how much of this is to the credit of the book it's based on, but to my knowledge there aren't many films where this is the case. To be clear, there will always be movies where it's not only important but necessary to the story to be about the queer perspective. But it does feel like a step forward for the future of romantic cinema as a whole that we now also have movies where queerness is represented without it being required that it's a narrative focal point. I feel this way about diversity in film as a whole, and that both forms of representation are required for us to ever achieve an ideal version of inclusivity in the medium. All of this is to say that Call Me By Your Name proved the broad appeal and universal relatability of the brief encounter genre. With warm, hazy cinematography and a leisurely, dreamlike cadence, not many movies better capture both the heightened euphoria and brutal come-down of a summer romance. I should mention that the issue of their age difference and actor Armie Hammer's extracurriculars that later came to light make the film slightly less digestible for me, but it's a testament to the film's strength that it still holds up as one of the better modern examples of brief encounter romance. Meanwhile, director Andrew Haigh has proven a master of the genre with two lovely films, Weekend and All of Us Strangers. Weekend is the before sunrise blueprint stripped down to its most organic form, tying in themes of identity, sexuality, and being queer in a world that, despite decades of incremental progress, continues to push back against it. Instead of a whimsical romantic stroll through Europe, two men begin their transient love story in the wake of a sloppy one-night stand. Chris New's Glenn is passionate and comfortable in his skin, while Tom Cullen's Russell carries the weight of uncertainty around his own identity. However, Russell is faced with reconciling these emotions when he realizes Glenn is leaving town in just a few days. Every inch of this movie is beautifully subtle and organic, and had you told me they set up cameras and documented a real-life romance unfolding, I'd almost have to believe you. The performances feel extremely lived in, and the characters are free of any cinematic gimmicks while still feeling distinct. There's a lovely scene where Glenn pretends to be the father Russell never met, so he could experience what it would be like to come out to a parent. It not only adds a layer of intimacy to their encounter, but it punctuates the sting Russell feels when they're forced to say goodbye. Haigh's follow-up, All of Us Strangers, doubles down on this brand of melancholy, then injects it with a hefty dose of surrealism and is deeply moving as a result, though I think that one requires a rewatch and a lot more processing before I'd be able to talk about it as thoroughly. But it's certainly one that left an impression, and I highly recommend seeking it out. These brief glimpses into the impact two people can have on each other gets at something painfully human. Sure, there's that what-if element that we've all experienced and can haunt us over time, but it's also strange how a connection that powerful, romantic or otherwise, can help us find something in ourselves we never discovered through years of friendships or other relationships. That idea is best realized in what I would go so far as to call one of the great underrated masterpieces of the 21st century, Kogonada's Columbus. The movie follows Jin, played by John Cho, who's forced to fly from South Korea to the small town of Columbus, Indiana, where his emotionally distant father, an architecture scholar in town for a lecture, falls into a coma. He soon meets Casey, played by Haley Lou Richardson, who's an architecture enthusiast obsessed with the town's rich history in the field, while feeling somewhat stuck there at the same time. This is a movie that on its surface is quiet, small, and modest in its ambitions. After all, most of the film sees Jin and Casey walking under cloudy skies and admiring striking architecture, while voicing only the barest of their wants and needs. But after seeing it for the first time, I simply could not get this movie out of my head. There are plenty of movies that immediately left more of an impact on me, but very few have made me want to return to them as much as I have Columbus. And I think a lot of that is due to how much the film, just like the many visually alluring structures within it, communicates so much through minimalism. The silence between what Casey and Jin choose to share telegraphs everything else they may be thinking and not saying out loud. And oftentimes the delivery of the simplest lines of dialogue completely changes their meaning. Because ultimately the dialogue in this movie doesn't tell you what to feel, the imagery does. Think of it as impressionism through a cinematic lens. I'll give an example to simplify the headiness here. When Jin and Casey first meet, they're on opposite sides of a steel fence outside of the inn Jin is staying in. Casey offers Jin a cigarette, and at first he's apprehensive and guarded, but when he's met with kindness from Casey, he accepts the cigarette and lets his guard down ever so slightly. The two begin walking as they talk, parallel on their respective sides of the fence, with Jin stopping and turning every time Casey gently pries about his father or the state of his health. They eventually meet at an open gate, standing side by side. That's when Jean leans in and finally turns the tables, asking Casey a question about herself. On paper, there's nothing particularly special about this scene or its dialogue, but when paired with body language and simple yet effective visual storytelling, it's clear we're watching Jin literally come out from behind his walls and open himself up to someone. That tells us from the beginning that for however long these characters will be in each other's lives, a part of them is always intertwined. The film shows us the few relationships with other people they each have in their respective lives, and in contrast to those, Jin and Casey challenge each other to push towards a better future for themselves, rather than remaining stuck in the past. The film's insistence on keeping their relationship entirely platonic only strengthens their unique bond, as none of their affinity for each other can be reduced to subconscious attraction. Sometimes we're just drawn to people, and those connections can put so much into perspective, as does a simple nudge from someone who truly understands us. In the end, Jin helps Casey realize she's only holding herself back by staying in town, while he stays behind to care for his father regardless of their complicated relationship. The final hug between Casey and Jin is a cathartic release that feels somewhat hopeful that they might see each other again, but comforting in that either way their impact on each other's lives won't soon be forgotten. Like all brief encounter stories, it's a reminder that human connection doesn't always need to be physically present to last. When I think about why I find these types of films more affecting than traditional romance, it occurs to me that it's because most relationships or connections we'll have in this lifetime end sooner than we'd hope. Whether it's the first person you connected with after moving somewhere new, or someone you developed mutual feelings for and never got to see those feelings come to fruition, it's an inevitable part of life. Sure, there's a sadness that always comes with that, but it makes us appreciate the relationships we're able to hold on to. Most importantly, films like these remind us that getting the opportunity to form any connection is truly one of the most beautiful parts of being alive. And that's one last take on Brief Encounter movies. Next week, I'll be kicking off another series called Double Features. Each episode, I'll be curating a themed double feature for you, the listener, to check out every month, complete with a deep dive into both films. Be sure to follow the podcast to stay updated. I'll be expanding to Apple Podcasts and YouTube in the very near future. And as a reminder, you can check out more of my movie thoughts on Letterboxd under one_last_take. This episode is dedicated to the first guy who was ever able to make me care about on-screen romance, Rob Reiner, as well as his wife Michelle. Your art will be remembered and loved forever. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you next time.